fasting among the Sámi of the Kola Peninsula. In the year 1681, a new military governor arrived at the Kola fort. The fort was established in the 16th century when King Frederick II of Denmark-Norway laid claim to the Russian-controlled part of the Kola Peninsula. The peninsula was settled by humans as far back as 9,000 years, but the inhabitants most recently associated with it, the Sámi, did not arrive until approximately 1,000 years ago. The Sámi are a semi-nomadic people who did not establish a state and lived in clans ruled by elders. For their entire history on the Kola Peninsula, the Sámi had to pay tribute to either the Norwegians or the Novgorodians, sometimes both, or since the fall of the Novgorod Republic in 1471, to the Muscovites. The Muscovites generally treated the Sámi reasonably well, all things considered, primarily because the Sámi were semi-nomadic and always had the option of migrating from the Russian-controlled territory to that of Norway if Russian demands became too burdensome, or Russian tax collectors more ruthless than their Norwegian colleagues. Finland, which does not control any of the Barents Sea coastline favored by some of the Sámi, although an independent country on present-day maps, was occupied by the Swedes and remained a part of the Kingdom of Sweden from the 12th century until 1809, when it was occupied by the Russians and became an autonomous Grand Duchy within the Russian Empire. Finland became an independent country in 1918-1919 as a result of the 1917 Communist Revolution in Russia. In fact, in 1620, Tsar Michael, the first of the Romanovs, specifically forbade sending tax collectors to the Sámi who had not yet been baptized, or to use any force against them. Thus, the new military governor who arrived in Kola in 1681, among other duties, was tasked by Tsar Michael's son Fyodor with converting the Sámi to Orthodoxy, but to do so with love, by inviting rather than forcing them. As an aside, this invitation was to include 2, 2.5, or 3 rubles paid to each Sámi who decided to accept baptism. In order to assess the missionary situation, the governor sent priest Aleksey Simonov to visit the settlements. Father Simonov, accompanied by a trusted man from the fort, set out for the trip in November of 1681 and traveled for over 3 months, visiting 8 Sámi settlements of the 10 they planned to visit. One settlement was too remote, another one apparently refused to accept the missionaries. At each stop, Father Simonov gathered the Sámi, read to them the Tsar's decree, and asked questions about their religious life and customs in a spiritual way, with love and acceptance. According to the report Father Simonov prepared for the governor, the Sámi readily repented of their heathen ways, dismantled their pagan altars, and built Christian chapels. It is impossible to know whether the report accurately conveys the circumstances or is colored in some way by Father Simonov's optimism and cheerful disposition. Be that as it may, the set of questions the missionaries used included a few questions about fasting, the object of our interest here. In every settlement, the Sámi said that they had all been baptized since a long time ago, but they had never known any Christian customs and had never heard any preaching of the Holy Gospel or pious teachings from anyone, and had never been to a church and had never received the sacrament of repentance or communion, because they lived far from the fort, 100 verst or more. 1 verst or versta is slightly greater than 1 kilometer. According to the Sámi, a priest from the fort came once a year, together with tax collectors, in order to perform baptisms, and stayed only for a day, unable to offer any pious instruction on account of commotion. Vrima suetne. None of the Sámi kept the fast in any way. Father Simonov wrote in his report that they, the Sámi, during holy fasts, eat meat out of necessity, and they eat strangled animals and blood. See Acts chapter 15, verse 20. Because of the complete lack of access to churches, clergy, or Christian instruction, it may be supposed that the Sámi may not have known anything about fasts or when these fasts were to be observed, and thus would not be observing them even if they could. However, the very lifestyle of the Sámi, that of semi-nomadic reindeer herders, fishers, and trappers, was not conducive to keeping a vegan diet for 40 days at a time, several times per year. To be sure, despite the Kola Peninsula being almost completely inside the Arctic Circle, some crops do grow there. Barley, for example, has been cultivated in Norway for at least 4,000 years. But agriculture requires a lifestyle centered around permanent settlements. In other words, the Sámi would have to completely change their way of life. Following reindeer herds, fishing and trapping provided plenty of meat, including blood, used in traditional Sámi cuisine, but no stable supply of grains. There is no indication that the Church ever expected the Sámi to abandon their traditional lifestyle in order to cultivate Lenten foods. There is also no mention in Father Simonov's report of any attempt to urge the Sámi to keep the fasts. Even though the missionary reported the building of chapels in each Sámi settlement he visited, it is far from clear what that actually meant, since the Sámi did not maintain what might be considered permanent structures even for their dwellings, nor did they remain in their settlements year-round. Additionally, in the absence of clergy, it is not at all clear how a chapel could be used by people who claim to know nothing at all about Christianity in general, and Orthodox practices in particular. In one of the settlements on the border with Norway, more than 400 verst from the Russian fort, Father Simonov did find what he described as a church, apparently built a century earlier during the reign of Tsar Ivan IV. As the Sámi conveyed to Father Simonov, there was no priest at that church, because our area is breadless. Bread does not grow here, and there is nowhere to buy it, and a priest would have nothing to eat here. It may be the case that a priest was understood as someone who would have had to both keep the fasts and abstain from traditional blood dishes and game harvested through trapping, and would thus be unable to survive without bread. An additional layer of complexity is that the Eucharist requires access to wheat bread and grape wine. Even if a priest were to get a dispensation to subsist on dried deer meat and lingonberries, he would not be able to celebrate the liturgy without bread. Norwegians had only limited success growing small amounts of wheat beginning in the 10th century, around the time that they began converting to Christianity. However, they were able to grow just enough for the needs of the church until the 1970s, when cold-tolerant wheat varieties were finally developed. Those, however, were the Norse living in permanent settlements. The semi-nomadic Sámi would not have been able to produce wheat even for the needs of one small church without altering their lifestyle. The feasibility of delivering a supply of wheat and wine once a year at the time of taxation cannot be ascertained here, except insofar as it, apparently, had not been a viable option in the century prior to Father Simonov's visit to the church. The problematics of the dependence of the Eucharist on wheat bread and grape wine which, while abundant in the Mediterranean, are not native to many areas of human habitation or to many human cultures and have to be imported or require a shift in agriculture, lifestyle, and economy. The problematics of these factors deserve a separate treatment in another post. The problematics of a traditional Christian fast also seem to be complex. The type of fasting that has in time become traditional for Christians, that is to say, a vegan diet for lengthy periods of time with a heavy reliance on grains and olive or seed oils, can be observed in agricultural societies living in permanent settlements in temperate climates, but become impractical for any other lifestyle or in any other climatic zone. Even for present-day Americans, the situation is far from clear. Whatever one may believe about man's contribution to climate change, shrimp sold in upstate New York is flown here from Thailand, more than 13,000 kilometers away, or a third of the circumference of our planet, and consumers of olive oil would do well to remember that there are not enough olive trees on our planet to produce the amount of olive oil sold in the shops. Many estimates claim that up to 80% of what is labeled as extra virgin olive oil, in fact, is not. In any case, olive trees do not grow in New York, and oil has to be imported from thousands of miles away. For most of human history, such items were a rarity and a luxury, and it is only thanks to our modern global transportation system and supply chain that we are able to buy oil from California, avocados from Mexico, and shrimp from Thailand at a grocery shop in upstate New York. But is this a good thing? What would it look like if Lenten fare consisted solely of foodstuffs native to New York or Alberta or the Kola Peninsula? Would it not be worthwhile to re-envision fasting as actually fasting rather than dieting as a viable practice for observing Christian fasts? At the very least, perhaps there may be an occasion for a serious conversation about what makes a shrimp from a farm in Thailand Lenten and an egg from a neighbor's farm not.